a little bit about myself. I grew up in the Deep South in a little town that some of you may have heard of. It's called New York City. It's in southern New York. They make paste picante sauce. And as an undergraduate student, I linked up with a professor who came in from UC Davis at City College of New York, smack in the middle of Harlem, and he went through culture shock. He ended up as the assistant curator of North American archaeology at the American Museum of Natural History, which was my playground as a kid. Whenever we played hooky, take the subway, museums were free. And he asked 30 of us who would volunteer to work with him on his collections from central Nevada, the East River Valley. I was the only one that expressed interest. I started to work with him in the museum, in the anthropology department. I ended up teaching in the education department, in the Man in Africa Hall and North American Indian Hall. It prompted me to get more and more involved in Indian affairs as an undergraduate student. And I ended up, instead of going to East Africa, where I took a year of Swahili, I ended up excavating a 10,000-year-old cave with the American Museum and National Geographic, and we did an educational film in 1973. By 1975, I was excavating up by Lake Tahoe, Squaw Valley and Alpine Meadows, where they were putting in the sewer lines for the expanded ski lodges. And I worked with the Washoe tribe there, and also the Paiutes and Shoshone of Nevada. And I became a state archaeologist in 1975 to 1978. Worked for the Forest Service up by the Lassen National Forest, by Burney Falls and up in that area. And then 1978, I was asked to apply for a job as the anthropology lab director at San Jose State University. 1978. 1980, I had already been working on archaeological sites around the Greater Bay Area, including Scotts Valley in 1980, where we tested the area where the new city hall was going to be built. And these two students brought this woman to my office, and she told me she was an Ohlone Indian. And I said, I'm new to California, and I know nothing about the Ohlone Indians. So we went to the library on campus, pulled out the quintessential tome, The Authority on California Indians, published in 1925 by Alfred Kroeber from UC Berkeley, or was in Berkeley. And he was the father of California anthropology. And we opened up his 900-page tome, which was published through the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology. So he's got to deal with these symbols of authority. And he wrote, the Costanoan, which is another term for the Ohlone, group is extinct for all practical purposes are concerned. So I looked at her and I said, well, you must be some other tribe. And she said, I beg to differ with you and Kroeber. I am an Ohlone Indian. My mother's an Ohlone Indian. She was born on the Sunol Rancheria up in the East Bay in 1911 and baptized as an Indian in 1912 at Mission San Jose. So I asked her, what do you want me to do? And she says, we want to go through the mission records and see if we can reconstruct the family's genealogies all the way back to the founding of the missions. And that's what we successfully did. And in the meantime, we were also working on the politics of erasure in a contemporary framework, circum San Francisco Bay, including archaeologists, not Rob Edwards, but other archaeologists that refused to allow the Ohlones to have any access to their heritage sites. So I want to open up by saying I want to honor the memory of archaeologist Robert Edwards, and some of you may have known him. He was a professor of archaeology at Cabrillo College, and he was an important educator that educated many generations, if you will, of archaeologists in the greater area. And he was also a scholar and just a damn decent person. And he passed away on May 17th. So I'm going to be talking about both the politics of erasure and the reclamation and restoration of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe's history, heritage, and federally recognized tribal status. And many of you have heard the name Ohlone before. I don't know if all of you ever heard of Muwekma, but in their own language, Muwekma means the people. So back from extinction, this is an overview of Muwekma Ohlone tribal history, including a sampling of tribal evidence submitted to the Department of Interior for the federal acknowledgement process. In Washington, D.C., you spell American Indian 25 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 83. So we're going to look at some of that, but I'm going to take you by the hand through several of the sites. I am also going to show you some images of the burials that the tribe has worked on over the years. So here's Kroeber. He was a great professor, came out of Columbia University, and he wrote The Coast of Knowing Group is extinct for all practical purposes are concerned. He interviewed the elders that were attached to Mission San Jose, San Juan Bautista, and San Carlos. So he did this in the early part of the 20th century, and it was Phoebe Apperson Hearst who bought the tribe's rancheria near Pleasanton, who funded the anthropology department at Berkeley and invited him and the other anthropologists to come down to interview the elders of the tribe, still speaking their language. So the woman on the right is Rosemary Chambers, the woman I met in 1980. And the woman to the left is her mother, who was born on the Sunol Rancheria in 1911. There were many families still around between the Pleasanton, Sunol, Livermore, and Niles Rancherias. During the early part of the 20th century, Indians still could not really own land. So who are the Muwekma Ohlone? The tribe is comprised of all the surviving Native American lineages who are Aboriginal of the greater San Francisco Bay region and whose ancestors were missionized into Mission Dolores, San Francisco, Santa Clara, and San Jose, and who comprise the historic BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, documented federally recognized Verona Band of Alameda County. The Muwekma became federally recognized after the discovery of the 18 unratified treaties of 1851-52 and through the Congressional Homeless California Indian Appropriation Acts of 1906 and 1908, and through other federal actions during later years. We'll explore that later on. So the birth of California is a very unique landmass. And we know the symbolism between water and land was very significant to the Indians of California. And their story of creation is that the world was once covered with water, and a floating feather turned into eagle, who was one of the first people, later on joined by coyote and hummingbird, and a culture hero called Cocknoo, who is prairie falcon. California became one of the most complex areas of North America, which comprised almost all the major language groups of Native Americans throughout the Americas. They ended up in California. The revised estimated population in 1769 has been revised upwards to 1 million to 1.5 million Indians living in the state. It was very densely populated. Majority of them were not agricultural. They did grow tobacco for their ceremonies, but we also know that they were reduced down to less than 20,000 left alive by the 1920s. So the Muwekma territory is in the northern Coastanoan area, circum San Francisco Bay, basically from Morgan Hill north to San Francisco and also the Straits of Carquinez. This was a clear day flying over the San Francisco Bay when I opened the window in the airplane and I took out my camera and I took a picture of the ground. The San Francisco Bay is a relatively recent geomorphic feature. It is around 5,000 years old. With rapid sea level rise at the end of the Pleistocene, it broke through the Golden Gate and filled the inland valleys. And you could see by the landforms, there's a myriad of elevations and therefore various food resources that were available to this ever-changing natural environment. And the Indian communities and societies evolved and changed with them. So we know that California was principally green all year, that all that brown stuff that you see are invasive species of grasses that were introduced, they're old world grasses that outcompeted the bunch grasses that were green or verdant all year round. We also know that the natives of California burned the land in order to create a parkland environment, feeding nutrients in the ground, and created higher seed yields, not only for the Indians to harvest, but also to support larger populations of herbivores, such as antelope, deer. Let me go back one. Yeah, deer and Bambi, elk. So there were at least two types of elk that were hunted, Tule elk and Roosevelt elk in the San Francisco Bay. And we're working on a project on ancient DNA on the various elk remains that we find in archaeological context. We know that the tribes kept black bears as pets, which most of you do. And of course, there was the ubiquitous grizzly bear that took a terrible toll on native people. And these guys were also thought to be people that were transformed into bears. The San Francisco Bay was a highway for trade and various Thule boats, some of them fairly large, that we learned from the expedition of the San Carlos of 1775, which was the first Spanish ship into the San Francisco Bay. And they were visited by people on the North Shore and the South Shore as well. We also know that salmon and steelhead trout were exceedingly important to native people. They were fishing people. They harvested sturgeon in the bay as well. We find sturgeon remains in archaeological sites. And early European travelers described that the skies would be completely blackened by the hundreds of thousands of migrating waterfowl and other birds that visited the San Francisco Bay. Another foods. We know that they went after the pinnipeds, the various seals, harbor seals, and elephant seals, I guess, and sea lions, and occasionally took whales as well, like Humphrey. Anyway, so the San Francisco Bay, at least from part of Marin, might have been occupied by the Ohlone, as well as the Lower Napa Valley. And they were intermarried with the tribes to the east and northeast of them prior to and after Spanish contact of 1769 and missionization. The first mission being Mission San Carlos in 1770 and Mission San Francisco in 1776. So up at Scotts Valley, now we're shifting to archaeology, where they're putting in the city hall in 1980, we tested the area to see if the site had any integrity, and we found stratigraphic integrity at this location. So in the meantime, some person up there took a bulldozer or cat and bulldozed the majority of the site. Didn't believe we should be doing archaeology in Scotts Valley. So the Santa Cruz Archaeological Society sued him. We had a small budget as a result. And so we cleaned up the area that was damaged. And we had what they called the Memorial Day weekend excavation from the various universities, Santa Clara, Stanford, San Jose State, Cabrillo College, and others join in to do 3 days of excavation. And the Muwekmas were here at that time too, to see and participate in the excavations. And you can see in the northern, the up area, my name, Alan Leventhal, I was in charge of Area A. And Dave Fredrickson from Sonoma State University had the central area. And Bill Hildebrandt, who came out of UC Davis, had the Area C. So as you can see by this photograph, carefully doctored, you can see the arrow pointing to Alan. I had more hair then. And I'm standing on a surface. So these are buried surfaces that we were able to date, radiocarbon date, the organic materials recovered from there. And the surface I'm standing on dated between 7,500 to 8,500 years ago. And then we went deeper and found additional buried surfaces. At the deepest levels, we found these gigantic spear points made out of Monterey chert. We had not really seen this style of spear point before. Monterey chert is an oil agate from the Miocene that basically is readily available at Año Nuevo, but there were other areas where this raw material comes out. It's a 14-million-year-old formation. And it was kind of like the obsidian before obsidian became readily traded into the area. We also found grinding slabs out of granodiorite. So to the left of this is a highly polished area. And what they ground were seeds, as far as we could tell. And this is a quartzite handstone, or also known as a mono. And to the lower left, you could see it has a reddish hue to it. And before it was washed, I took samples, took it to the geology boys at San Jose State. And what they discovered through XRF, I believe, or X-ray diffraction, that was cinnabar. And what cinnabar is mercury sulfide. And mercury sulfide most likely came from the New Almaden mines. So we speculated that this is hinting at evidence that the Indians were mining the New Almaden mines between 7,500 and 8,500 years ago. This is a basalt knife. We call it a biface because of the way it's flaked. The bottom edge was highly polished. That's how we could tell it's a knife, based upon wear patterns. Shifting gears to Highway 101, down by Metcalf Avenue, this was the Blood Alley project that we worked on in the early 1980s, where they put in 101 with Monterey Road in the background over there. And I'm on a skateboard going down this hill, taking photographs. And we found evidence of a highly stratified, this is also paralleling Coyote Creek. So we went down 29 feet deep. And what we found at the bottom of the 29 feet were hobos living down below. We had cultural materials, including flakes and stone tools made out of Monterey chert, which occurs to the west of the San Andreas Fault. But we got dates of 9,300, 9,800, and 9,900 years on the organic material. The recent discovery of human remains at Walsh Avenue in Santa Clara, the site is California, Santa Clara 1070, and the tribe named it Mani Fuyu Muwekma Yatish Tuneshte, where the ancient people are buried site located west of the San Jose airport. And what they found while building this data center were these particular burials. Now, I usually pride myself, after all these years of doing archaeology, of thinking that because these burials were not buried in coffins, but are in proximity to the location of the first and second Mission Santa Clara, 1777, that these were people from the local village. Well, this is the first time I have to admit I was really badly wrong. These burials date between 10,300 to 11,000 years ago. So we're radiocarbon dating the burials. So the tribe gave us permission to do these studies. So in between them putting in these foundational beams for the building, we were uncovering the burials there, you can see. The other interesting thing was below this stratum of a kind of cultural burial area, we found ancient bison antiquus and camel, but they were fossilized, so they predate the people that are buried here. But it tells us something about the paleo-environmental reconstruction along the Guadalupe River area. It was a nice place to live back 10,000, 11,000 years ago, and I'm not too sure of the age of these ancient bison, but they like living there too. Here's some more of the burials that were found. So you can see how difficult it is for archaeologists to work between construction in order to try to learn and preserve information as much as possible. And so this is also information for the scientific community and for the tribe. And then the tribe charges us to be able to do exhibits and presentations that would benefit the general public. They want people to know about their history and heritage. So you can see on the right-hand side, the dates of 10,400, 8,900, 9,400. Those are dates that it's on human bone, but still have to be updated and recalibrated. That will push it back a little further. So my area, when I first came to San Jose State, was looking at the so-called shell mounds around the San Francisco Bay, because in the 1800s, knowing about the shell mounds gave early people and scholars the interpretation that these shell mounds were basically garbage dumps and shell heaps left by the people living in a village. And what I did is I looked at Alameda 329 down in Coyote Hills, and Emeryville is another important site, which I will show you a picture of. There was an archaeologist back in '65 named Suggs, and he presented a refuse heap village accumulation model proposed by earlier writers. He said that the Emeryville shell mounds was in fact little more than a huge garbage heap that had collected through the many centuries that Indians had lived in the area. This is Emeryville. It was at one time 60 feet high and 1,000 feet long. And if you look carefully, the stuff you're looking at ain't shell. It's earth of different, sand, silt, and there is some shell in there. And they were able to take away, people could buy these mounds in the turn of the century, the early part of the 20th century. And on the extreme right, you see a steam shovel taking away as topsoil. And an archaeologist named Schenck from Berkeley would run in between shovel scoops, and he salvaged 701 burials from this mound. This mound, along with the other ones, were constructed. And so at Alameda 329 at Coyote Hills, which was not as large a mound, but San Jose State University and Stanford excavated the mounds that were at the interface of the wetlands at Coyote Hills. If you haven't been out there, it's real cool. In the lower portion of the excavations, that Stanford's 10 by 10 foot excavation units went down 16 feet deep. And up on the top is the San Jose State, and like the railroads, they met in the middle. And you can see the little tiny cars for scale. Mm-hmm. And I looked at everything we covered from the San Jose State excavations in yellow. The fellow standing there looking east toward the Hamilton Range, he was described as being 6 feet tall. That will give you scale. And if you look at the soil matrix, there isn't much shell, although shell is perfectly preserved from the top all the way to the bottom, which means that the soil matrix is basic. It's not acidic. The preservation is incredible. And you can see the scope of the excavations. And at the very base of the mound, they found these particular people very well preserved, dating between around 190 BC to 900 AD is the time period, what it was called the middle period at that time. And the people were also face down, kind of heading toward the west, the setting sun. Here's a series of burials that what we understand when the Spanish came through, they talked about these poles that were placed in the cemeteries, which were located outside of villages to mark the location of the graves. So what you see in red, this is a stratigraphic profile, just simply shows burials from 900 AD and earlier. The orange is 900 AD to 1500 AD, and the yellow is from 1500 AD to the surface to around 1700s. So this site was occupied by the dead for a period of 2,000 years. This demonstrates continuous use of these sites to demonstrate stability of these native populations. So we also had neophytes, little babies that were buried with basically enormous wealth, with these anthropomorphic pendants that we believe are associated with the Kuksu religion. Kuksu was a form of religion that spread throughout Central California. These abalone shells are distinctive emblems of elites, of the nobility. So these were the pyramids of the dead, of the noble craftspeople and fallen warriors. They were cremated, the fallen warriors. Here is a large flower pot shaped mortar over this woman. This young woman from 15 years old had olivella beads. You can see the shell beads that were around her neck. And what was interesting, what was in her mouth. We found these things, not the dime, but needles, sewing needles. The implication is they were concerned about aesthetics and refined kinds of basketry and other kinds of weavings. Other people were buried with these bird bone tubes that were bird bone whistles that were used for ceremonies. The upper ones were covered with asphaltum that came from the Pacific coast north of Santa Cruz, and also applied beads to it, no doubt featherwork. So these were ceremonial regalia, and these are principally found with people in these mounds. Oh, I did that one already. This shows you some of the artifacts on the mounds. To the right, are elk antler harpoon points. They did not have steel to carve elk antlers. Some of you ought to try to get hold of an elk antler, take a rock and try to make something like these. Down below, to the left of them are obsidian Stockton serray points, these were used for hunting and warfare. So we do find fallen warriors with these embedded in their midsection, in bone. So we know that they were engaged in military pursuits. To the left of that are 3 pipes made out of steatite, and the one on the far left is fine-grained sandstone. We know that they grew tobacco, and they grew tobacco because they had to make sure that wild tobacco grows on disturbed soil. And what is disturbed soil? Cemeteries. So in order to make sure, in cemeteries, the dead were dangerous to the living. So cemeteries were places of danger to living people, and especially during the cremation periods, when the smoke of burnt people, they would protect the children and kept them away. But anyway, these are torepas, and you can see in the middle one a bird bone tube, a polished bird bone tube there. And to the left of that are anthropomorphic, meaning hands and feet with the big head. These were the big heads of the Kuksu, going back around 1400, 1100 AD. Here is another shot of them. Now, these are carefully made. They are carefully crafted. Not everyone had access to abalone. If abalone, if I can equate it in Western terms, was gold, and these were more than gold, because even wealthy people did not have access to these guys. But the point, though, is that the distribution of wealth was measured in terms of abalone pendants and beads. Up by Pleasanton, they found one man who had 28,000 beads, Alavella beads, that were cut into little squares affixed to his garment, as well as mica plates around his head that was part of a regalia that he wore. So the other thing is that this was not a village, because this would flood in the springtime for upwards to 6 months out of the year before they put in the levees. So there is no, there's no fresh water here for people to live, and there really isn't firewood, except for what you're seeing there is principally poison oak and willow. So when the Spanish arrived, they were able to entice teenagers of the elites to come into the missions, because the Spanish represented a new power brokerage, and the elites wanted their teenagers to be the intermediaries between the tribal leadership and these newly arrived Spanish. And as they were missionized, they were allowed to practice secular dancing. And the priests had no knowledge about some of the symbolism. And if you look at the guy in the middle, you can see there's a duality of red and it's green on the screen here. But that duality also represents the cosmological juxtaposition between land and water. Villages were kept clean and in proximity to fresh water. This is Cheetah down by Watsonville Road we worked on in 1989. This is in Amamutsun territory. And you could see their various activities that were depicted: the harvesting of tule. Women wore tule aprons with the deer skin apron. They wove beautiful baskets. And this is a cooking basket with very intricate designs. And this is a gift basket that was used as a prestige item with Alavella beads and abalone pendants. Surplus foods were moved to chiefly villages, and the world would change when this handsome dude, he was of the House of Bourbon, which is what he also drank, but he married a noble woman in Naples. He was the Duke of Naples, and he becomes the King of Spain, Carlos III. And in 1769, he was an adept administrator. he decided to have the expeditions into Alta California because the fledgling Americans, or the colonies, were entering into Spanish territory as far west as St. Louis and as far south as Florida. The Russians were coming in, the English were exploring, and they wanted to make permanent settlement into Alta California. So we have the Portola expedition and the De Anza expedition, along with others. These were military expeditions. And we have a guy named Pedro Fejas, who becomes governor later on. And he wrote in 1775 a historical, political, natural description of California, which has been translated. And he said that besides their chiefs of villages, they have in every district another who commands 4 or 5 villages together, the village chiefs being his subordinates. Each of them collects every day in his village the tributes which the Indians pay him in seeds, fruits, game, and fish. The subordinate captain is under obligation to give his commander notice of every item of news or occurrence. So they had a network of communication, but this demonstrates they were socially stratified. And so when we did from the mission records, we were able to, this is principally Randy Milliken, who passed away, but for his doctoral dissertation at Berkeley, he was able to try to place the location of the principal villages and districts in the San Francisco Bay based upon the mission records. But what is interesting is the first Spanish ship, the San Carlos, in the bay. This is a painting of the Spanish packet, San Carlos, and they left a very rich record. And the second line down, it says, there was an authority over all these Indians, one whose kingly presence marked his eminence above the rest. Our men made a landing, that's in south of the Straits of Carquin, and when they had done so, the Indian chief addressed them in a long speech. Anyway, the point, though, is that these are rules of social conduct, how you treat distinguished guests. So the world could be divided into distinguished guests or enemy, people who are dangerous. So they have a feast. And while they were having a pleasant time with the Indians, our men saw a large number of heathen approaching, all armed with bows and arrows. They came into the village with their arms, their bows and arrows drawn, honoring the presence of the Spanish. And of course, the Spanish freaked out. They said this obliged the sailing master to make known by signs to the Indian chiefdom the misgivings they had in the presence of so many armed tribesmen. The chief, understanding what was meant, at once directed the Indians to loosen their bows and put up all their arrows. They were prompt to obey. The number of Indians who had gathered together was itself alarming enough. There were more than 400 of them, and all, or most of them, were of good height and well built. Basically, they're saying that around 400 warriors came dancing into the village. These are what the warriors look like. The Chovolone of the East Bay. This is near Mount Diablo. Some of the male burials we worked on, the men are around 6 feet tall. Some of the other people are more diminutive. So Mission San Francisco was established 1776. In 1816, the Russian expedition, the ship Rurik, came through, and a brilliant French artist named Louis Chorus did sketches of the Indians there. He did a before and after. You can see the man in the lower right doesn't look too happy because the life expectancy of your family, he's in mourning, was between 2 to 45 years. Someone of your family died based upon the conditions. There were measles epidemics, later on smallpox epidemics, so people would flee the missions. But once you were baptized, you were not allowed to leave the missions without permission, without a paseo, a pass. And the Indians were severely flogged, and it would lead to rebellion. Indians. They were permitted to do secular dancing. The two priests are on the lower left there. And so they suppressed Indian religion because Indian religion was essentially devil worshiping. Mission Santa Clara was established in 1777. And at the third mission, which is on the campus, the third mission Neophyte Cemetery from 1781 to 1818, they estimate around 6,000 Indians died and were buried there. It's not all the Indians. And then when they moved to the fourth mission, there were another 2,000 or so Indian burials there. It was devastating to the lives of the Indian people. Mission San Jose was established in 1797, and it was established close to Pueblo de San Jose because the Indians of the East Bay that went into Mission San Francisco had enough. They were threatening to kill both the Indians and the priests that were building Mission San Jose. They had enough of missionization. In 1806, the Langsdorff expedition, they painted some of the Indians in their regalia, and this was a color tint, I think from the 1840s, of the dancers. And again, you can see the duality of the central figure with white and black. These are deep symbolisms. So when Indians ran away, the military and auxiliary, Native American auxiliary, went after the Indians across the bay. By 1836, Spain, Mexico, and California, basically all the Spanish territories, secularized the missions. The missions became too powerful, and then the edicts were half of the mission lands were to go to the emancipated Indians. One of the emancipated Indians was Lope Inigo, who got his land grant in 1844, where Moffett Field is today. So you see Mountain View, and in the square there, you can see by view, Inigo Reservation. He would eventually lose most of his land to American squatters after 1846 Bear Flag Rebellion and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, when the Americans conquer California. Well, this is going on. This woman who died around 1929 is Maria de los Angeles Colos. She was born on the Burnell Rancho and Santa Teresa in South San Jose. Her family moved up to the Alisal Rancheria area of Pleasanton, and she was one of the last fluent speakers of the Chocheño dialect, who was interviewed by many of the anthropologists. Her parents were married at Mission Santa Clara in 1838. The world would change when Senator Thomas Hart Benton sent his son-in-law, John C. Fremont, to seize California. And so in organizing a rebellion, the Bear Flag Rebellion, warfare broke out between the Californios and these Americans, and hostilities ended in 1847. And by 1848, the United States had landed troops in Veracruz that moved up to Mexico City. They threatened to destroy Mexico City if Mexico did not cede in 1848 the area that you see in green: California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. So we got control of that area through one of the first American expeditions into another country to claim to the territory. So we also know about Sutter and Sutter's Mill and the discovery of gold. So the gold rush became internationally known, and the rush was on. The first football team in California were the 49ers. Around 300,000, upwards to 300,000 non-Indian men flocked into California through the Golden Gate, spreading to the Sierra. You can see some of the on the right-hand side in Northern California. They eventually would use water cannons to wash down the Sierra that would flood into this detritus, would go into the San Joaquin and the Sacramento rivers, and eventually silted in the San Francisco Bay, almost destroying all of the marine life. And for a while, the San Francisco Bay became a cesspool that was almost devoid of life. And it took the brilliance of various people to organize the cleanup of the San Francisco Bay and the restoration of the wetlands. The great fishing runs from Alaska down to the Pajaro River in Watsonville, they were basically mostly destroyed. So Indians no longer had fish. They could no longer burn the land throughout California, and they could really no longer hunt. And the only food that became readily available to them were acorns. This is why acorns become the staple, if you will. It's after the economic and ecological collapse of California. Now, even though California became a state in 1850, the only legal means that the federal government had to quiet the Aboriginal title to the lands in California was through treaty. So Congress appropriated $100,000. President Millard Fillmore identified 3 commissioners to treat with the California Indians, and they divided the state up into 18 districts or treaties. And in return for ceding California, giving up their title through treaty, 8.5 million acres of land were to be set aside. When the treaties reached Washington, D.C., the newly elected senators argued that Indians should get nothing, and the warfare and the murder of California Indians continued. The first governor, Peter Burnett, argued in front of the legislature that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. Must be expected. And while the warfare is going on in the interior and up north and in the Sierra and down south, Indian babies were being born and baptized at Mission San Jose. And this is Ambrosia Bonocco and Avelina Carnates, who would eventually have a large descendancy in the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. Because of the collapse of the universe by Indians in Nevada first, that spread throughout California, was the first religious revitalization called the 1870 Ghost Dance, which melded Christian beliefs of an apocalypse and then the resurrection of the dead. So the Indians believed that if they danced these dances and sang their songs, the dead will rise up again and the white man will be swallowed up and destroyed by the earth. This is the first ghost dance. The second ghost dance was 1890, that ended up in South Dakota amongst the Sioux at Wounded Knee. So they revitalized, as part of this religious revitalization, they revitalized their Kuksu dance regalia. These outfits are in Russia. They were collected in 1847. You would not see this person's face because it's a spirit impersonator. High lineage women in 1847 up in Contra Costa County wore these condor feathered moques. So they had complex feather work all the way through the collapse of their societies, or they greatly reduced. So these were the Kuksu religious pendants that were no longer being made. And in 1880s, around 1882, America outlawed Indian religion. It was reversed partly in 1978 under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. But you have to be from a federally recognized tribe to practice your religion. So they would arrest anybody practicing their dances, their religious dances, incarcerate them for 30 days. The regalia would be confiscated and burnt. And it was people back east from the museums that demanded of the military to send them the sacred regalia. And that's how many museums end up with a lot of the regalia from tribes. So this is Stonyford up in the Sacramento. But what you see is Kuksu on the right and these big heads. So if you put your fingers around those flailing, these, what do you call them? Anyway, they're kind of spikes with feather work. It emulates the abalone pendants, the big head pendants. They revitalized the religious houses. These are called tupintaks in the Muwekma language. They were semi-subterranean roundhouses. The largest one was recorded by the Spanish up on Gazos Creek on the Pacific coast. And they Spanish estimated it could hold the entire village of 250 people. So they had architecture. So in the early 20th century and the late 19th century, Indians were allowed to go to public school. And these are some of the Indians from the Nichols family, where you can see the arrows. They could go to Niles School. Phoebe Apperson Hearst and her husband, who was a US Senator, George Hearst, purchased 1,900 acres on the East Bay by Pleasanton. And she's the one that invited the anthropologists, including Kroeber, to interview the Indians. She funded the anthropology department as a rival of the Stamfords. So Kroeber had his field notes. He interviewed Jose Guzman, Angela Colos, who we saw the photo of earlier, and in Niles, Magdalena Armija. The tribe appears partially on the 1900 Indian census of Niles at the El Molino or Niles Rancheria, and also partially show up at Pleasanton. And to the left is George Santos and Pellegrino Pinos and Maria Trinidad Gonzalez Reyes and Paula up on the Pleasanton Rancheria. A man in San Jose named Charles E. Kelsey belonged to a philanthropic organization called the Northern California Indian Association, and they would meet up at Felton. And they were concerned about the dying Indians of California. And so he went back in 1905 to deliver a memorial with a schedule showing the location of the Indians, where he included Pleasanton and Niles. When they were there in 1905, he and a clerk for the Senate found sealed in the secret archives of the Senate the 18 unratified treaties that in 1852 were sealed in secrecy. No one was supposed to know that the Indians of California never gave up their legal title. And when they found the treaties, Congress freaked out because they realized the California Indians still had legal title to all of California. The problem was they were not US citizens. They had no rights whatsoever. So they named Kelsey a special Indian agent between 1905 and 1913, and he tried to purchase land for the landless Indians of California. He had to deal with Northern California, which was an area of Los Angeles to the Oregon border. So he creates a special Indian census of 1905-06, and he identifies some of the Muwekmas living at Pleasanton and Niles. This is when they become federally recognized and placed under his jurisdiction and the jurisdiction of the Indian Service Bureau. As they are waiting for some sort of help, the Indian children are starving to death. They are dying of starvation in Niles. These are several brothers here died, and they were buried at the Indian Cemetery at Mission San Jose. This is 1905. They again appear in the 1900 Indian census. Again, and Mercedes Marine, her older brother Dario Marine, and Mercedes' baby is Albert Marine. I'll get back to them. Albert Marine is the man to the right. His uncle is Dario Marine. And that house that you see on the left was one of the last of the casitas, the little houses at Pleasanton, which were burnt down by either Southern Pacific or Western Pacific Railroad in 1916. So they had to move and find work elsewhere. So a interesting concern about the Indians of Northern California, they asked what was provided to the Indians. Kelsey is asked to respond. He says, none of the treaties mentioned in the second Senate document were ever ratified. The government took everything ceded in the treaties and more. For example, the reservations and paid nothing. Absolutely no stops or measures had been taken to extinguish the rights of the tribes to the lands described in the treaties, unratified in any way, shape, or form. The Indian office did not even have a record of the 18 treaties until we dug them out of the secret archives of the Senate. This came from the National Archives, these documents. So he created a map of Northern California, Los Angeles to the Oregon border, and you can see Alameda, it says 30, Verona. They were named after Verona Station, built for Phoebe Apperson Hearst by Western Pacific Railroad. Here's another very significant anthropologist who interviewed Angela Colos in 1914, and at the bottom you can see Muwekma, gente. Muwekma means the people in their own language. Kelsey retires in 1913, and by 1914, everything shifts to the Reno Agency now. And you can see on the right-hand side, Verona 30, they are slated to have land purchased for them. While they're waiting for land, 7 Muwekma men served prior to and during World War I. They enlist in the Army, Navy, and the Marine Corps. And one of them is severely wounded. The fellow Franklin Guzman is severely wounded in the Marine Corps in France. And they're honorably discharged. And they joined 17,000 Indians serving overseas. These guys are buried at the Golden Gate National Cemetery. And the Presidio Trust and the Presidio service there, they don't want to hear about their service in the armed forces. In 1923, they are listed under the Reno Agency as a landless tribe. You can see on the right, San Benito County, the San Juan Batista Band. Those are the Amamutsun. Monterey are the Esalen and Salinan and Alameda Verona. They were still waiting for land purchase. Congress was still appropriating money. And in 1920s, the Osage of Oklahoma purchased their own reservation, which was the wealthiest spot in the country for oil. And they were systematically being murdered by white people claiming to be the executors of their estates and their oil. So they came to the White House and they asked Calvin Coolidge in Congress to pass legislation in order for them to control their own finances and their own lives, essentially. And so Indians become citizens in 1924, except for New Mexico and Arizona, not until 48. Kroeber publishes his Handbook of California Indians. Costanoan group is extinct. And a brilliant anthropologist, linguist, John Peabody Harrington from the Smithsonian, interviews Jose Guzman, died in 1934, and Angela Colos. And then in Sacramento is this moron named Sacramento Superintendent Lafayette Dorrington. He was investigated for dereliction of duty by Washington, D.C. He was a drunk. he removed 135 landless tribal bands from the list of tribes awaiting land purchase, and the very first was the Verona band of Alameda County. It was alphabetical order. And he wrote, there's one band in Alameda County commonly known as the Verona Band, located near the town of Verona. And the thing about that is that there was never a town of Verona. So it meant that he never visited them. He never did a needs assessment. He just decided to remove 135 tribes. And he says it does not appear at the present time there's need for the purchase of land for the establishment of their homes. Congress was appropriating money, and this is how the rancherias in California come to be, because of the landless legislation to try to provide few acres or several acres for their home sites so they can grow gardens. But much of the land that was for sale had no water, was rocky, and had no other resources on it. That was basically the only land available for Kelsey to purchase. So in 1928, Congress freaks out and passes the California Indian Jurisdictional Act because the California Indians start to sue as American citizens after they become citizens in 24 over 8.5 million acres of land that they never received. So here we see some of the Muwekmas, their enrollments, their full-bloods that are enrolling with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Again, here is Magdalena Armija Thompson and her children. One of them was Lawrence Thompson, served as a World War II veteran in the 640th Tank Destroyer in the Pacific. They were half-bloods, and he was a tribal councilman for the tribe. Lucas Marine put down on his BIA that his wife is a full-blood Ohlone, and his mother is also Ohlone, as well as himself. This is the only tribe to ever deploy the ethnonym Ohlone. And he says, my mother's parents belonged to Mission San Jose in Alameda County. The records of her family ought to be found there. This is what guided us to do research. Their son, this is Cecilia Armija, another Muwekma, but their son, Ernest Marine, served in the United States Army during World War II. His mother was Adelina, where you see the arrows pointing. His wife was Catherine Peralta Marine, who is also a Guzman. Her grandchildren continued to do the traditional dancing amongst the Maidu during the 1930s, 1940s, all the way, this is 1980s. And that's Joe Marine on the right in traditional regalia. The present chairwoman is Charlene Nijma. This is her grandmother and her uncle and aunts from Mission San Jose. Her uncle up there, Robert Sanchez, was in the 82nd Airborne Division, 508th Parachute Division, and the one in the center there, his brother was in Patton's Tank Division. And again, at the bottom is Rosemary and Dolores Sanchez. The image all the way on the right is a reburial over by where Highway 101 and 85, 100 burials, the tribe reburied. This is Albert Ariano. He is the grandfather of the present vice chair of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, and the descendants of Maria de Los Angeles Colos and Jose Guzman are also enrolled in the tribe. From his interviews, it says the Clareños, the Indians from Mission Santa Clara, were much intermarried with the Chocheños, the Indians of Mission San Jose. The dialects were similar. Muwekma la gente. Here we see it again. This is Joe Binoco. He was a full-blood. He was one of the last surviving members of the Mission San Jose Indian Band. He's a full-blood. And then here's Dolores Galvan, who's all her 5 sons served in the Army and Navy. The one in the center, Hank Alvarez, just died at the age of 100 years old. He was in the 101st Airborne Division at Utah Beach, Normandy. and his younger brother was in the 18th Mechanized Cavalry in Europe as well. The three other brothers also served in the United States Army. She writes a letter to Sacramento. 1936, my great-grandfather was chief of the tribe at Pleasanton. What happened to that Indian deal? A lot of people want to find out about it, so they asked me to write you. We heard there was a meeting about Indian claims. It took 4 years for Sacramento to respond. Mrs. Galvan is shown on the roll of California Indians as one half blood, Indian blood, but does not have ward status, therefore is not eligible for any aid from federal funds through this agency. And during this time, several of the Indian kids were shipped off to Indian boarding school, one at Sherman Institute and the other one up in Oregon here at Chemawa during the 30s and 40s. Lawrence Domingo Marine is shipped off in 1931. He graduates in 1939. He enlists in the Marine Corps in 1940, before Pearl Harbor. And that's him. He was too dark to go to school in the Bay Area, so they shipped him off. He is in every single major battle in the Pacific as a sergeant. And his brother, Ernest Marine, was in the Army 58th Field Artillery Battalion. Daniel Santos was in the 41st Infantry Division. Lawrence Thompson, who was a councilman, so was Hank Alvarez, a councilman, and his younger brother was on the USS Enterprise when it blew up and then enlisted in the Army. So these are just some of the men who served in the United States Armed Forces. In the 1947, they enroll and become members of the Bay Area California Indian Council. And then in the 40s to 50s, they enroll again with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Kroeber reverses himself and he says they're not extinct, they're still full-bloods. And there's a settlement for the value of 8.5 million acres of land with interest back to 1852, and a sum of $150 is given to each eligible Indian for the value of 8.5 million acres of land. So early 60s, the diocese is selling the Ohlone Indian Cemetery that had 4,000 Indian burials, including family members within living memory that were buried in the 20th century. So they start cleaning up the cemetery, and the American Indian Historical Society in San Francisco, which was a nonprofit, came to aid the tribe to basically try to get the title of the cemetery, which ultimately they did. And then there were all these publications in the 60s about the Ohlones of the East Bay. And then even Congressman Don Edwards tried to contact the Bureau of Indian Affairs and national parks to put the tribe's cemetery into trust status, and they rejected it. And this is a time period, let me just stop here, Zach. I know I'm full of hot air, but the man who was the director of the Japanese American internment camps, Dylan S. Myers, for doing such a good job for the Japanese Americans in incarcerating them, his next assignment was Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He had to deal with the returning 80,000 American Indians coming back from the Pacific and European theaters and Korea. And his job originally was to terminate every single tribe of the United States because they found gold, uranium, coal, oil, and other resources on Indian land. And the elected officials decided that this should be just shared between big business and themselves. And a series of lawsuits prevented a lot of the termination, but in California, 46 tribes were terminated by Congress. So they were not interested in supporting the rights of tribes, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So in the local newspapers, in the Newark News, they said there were 125 remaining Indians in Northern California. And I like the juxtaposition of 125 Indians in one cemetery and the thing with Nazi gangs, which are just astonishing to me. They appear and they publish in the Indian Historian. They again enroll with the Bureau of Indian Affairs from 68 to 72. And they're the only tribe to deploy Ohlone tribe, Ohlone Indians. This is Ernest Thompson, whose mother was enrolled in the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1928 to 30. And then his son served in Vietnam during the Vietnam War in the United States Army. And he was a guard on Alcatraz, and national parks know about him, but they don't want to talk about him because he's a Muwekma Ohlone Indian. Margaret Sanchez, she's an Ohlone Mission Indian. She was the last one baptized at Mission San Jose in 1920. She's on the right-hand side. Next to her is her son, who just passed away. He was served in Vietnam. Rosemary Camera next to him, who was the original chairwoman of the tribe, and then Monica Ariano, who's the vice chair of the tribe. Margaret Martinez was also a member of the Milpitas Historical Society. So there was a settlement for 64,425,000 acres of land, almost all of California with interest, back 1852. Those people that were eligible received checks for $668.61. And they were not allowed to have legal representation in the federal courts. Some of you may remember Melvin Belli from San Francisco, the king of tort. He represented a separate docket called the Achamawi Atsagewe Pit River Tribes. He was thrown out of the federal courthouse in San Francisco in 1970, and Berkeley did a film interviewing him. And he said in the film, I'm not allowed to represent my clients in the federal court. So constitutional processes are not accorded to tribes in California until after this settlement. And this is one of the checks. This is to Beatrice Marine. $668.51 was her share for the value of almost the entire state of California with interest. So you have to understand, California Indians had very little latitude to fight for their rights as tribes were being terminated and relocated off their reservations. So there was publications in 71, 150 descendants. They incorporated. Malcolm Margolin wrote a very nice book, but it was fictitious about, and all he had to say about the living Ohlone was, today the descendants of the Ohlone Indians are still amongst us, living close to the San Francisco and Monterey Bay areas. That's all he could say. It's a nice book, but it's totally fictitious. In the 1990s, 89-90, the tribe Muwekma repatriated 550 of their ancestral remains from Stanford University after the earthquake of 1989, and nobody could have access to the museum, was damaged. So they say, if there's no one going to study our remains and you don't have any reports for us, let us rebury our ancestral remains. And then they decided, in order to articulate their legal status, they decided to petition the federal government for status clarification as a federally recognized tribe. And they got a letter back because of the significance and permanence of acknowledgement as a tribe. So once you're federally recognized, it is permanent until the Congress terminates your status. So the Mercury News did a profile of her, of the chairwoman, in 1991 in West Magazine. We worked with Congress and the Senate. We created what was called the Advisory Council on California Indian Policy. I volunteered myself as an anthropologist from 1992 to 98 when we turned in the reports. we found that 80,000 California Indians that were once federally recognized and their descendants were no longer eligible for any particular services. So they went to the White House under Clinton in 1995. They hand carried their documentation. And in 1996, on May 24th, the hostile Bureau of Indian Affairs wrote that the Pleasanton or Verona Band of Alameda County was previously acknowledged between 1914 and 1927. The band was among the groups identified as bands under the jurisdiction of the Indian Agency at Sacramento, California. The agency dealt with the Verona Band as a group, identified it as a distinct social and political entity. And the band was among the bands proposed by Special California Indian Agent in 1914 for home site land under the appropriations for the homeless California Indians, which began in 1906. What is interesting that after this, the Bureau of Indian Affairs says you cannot use any of your documentation as proof that you are Indian, even though they said they were federally recognized. So in 2000, Congressman George Miller from Pleasant Hill introduced a Tribal Status Clarification Act. They included the Muwekma Ohlone tribe for reaffirmation or restoration of their status, and the Democrats would not allow it to get out of committee. Dianne Feinstein did not want to see any more California Indians federally recognized. But we did get resolutions from March Fang Yu, if you remember her, for the 3 historic previously recognized tribes. We even got a letter from the acting area director, Michael Smith. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is ready to assist the Sonungwe Council. They're a Hoopa group up in Northern California, and Muwekma seeking administrative federal recognition on the basis your tribes were never terminated. And then the Muwekma started to appear in various publications, and the tribe had to sue because the Bureau said it would take over 24 years before they could review the documents of the tribe for restoration. And in 1999, the suit was issued, and in 2000, Justice Urbina said the Muwekma tribe is a tribe of Ohlone Indians indigenous to the present-day San Francisco Bay Area. In the early part of the 20th century, the Department of Interior recognized the Muwekma tribe as an Indian tribe under the jurisdiction of the United States. So I'm not making any of this up. It's kind of, how do we know what we know? Lieutenant Governor Cruz Bustamante wrote to the Bureau, and they refused to look at his letter. I write you to urge you to support the petition 111 by the Muwekma Ohlone tribe for reaffirmation. Has demonstrated that it has had a trust relationship with the United States from 1906 to the present, and Congress never terminated their relationship. So this is some of the leadership of the tribe. There are now 600 members of the tribe. They were reduced down in 1920s to 62 people left alive. This is one of their campouts. 2001, another camp out in Big Feast. And this is Stanford renamed a building called Muwekma Taruk, House of the People, for the Native American theme house on campus. And they are now revitalizing their traditional dances that were exported from Pleasanton during the 1870 ghost dance. They are publishing the archaeological reports, and they're putting it online at academia.edu. I'm usually the principal author in putting together the archaeological report, but they are co-authors. They are not just in the acknowledgements. They are co-authors on these final reports on their history and heritage. We did a great exhibit above and below the bay at the Oakland Museum, except for the Oakland Museum will not allow the Muwekma one little case to present anything of their history and heritage at the museum, and they won't explain why. So we recently did an exhibit, several exhibits at the Los Gatos Museum, New Moon, called Reclamation, Resilience of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe, and Reclamation, Aboriginal Ancestral Homeland of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe. So thank you for your time to hear about the Muwekma tribe prehistory, history, and heritage and struggle. And as you have ascertained, the tribe and the people have never left their ancestral and historic homelands. And we hope that after this long and painful struggle, they will be restored once again as a federally recognized tribe, either by the end of this year or hopefully by the end of the decade. The hostility is just overwhelming. But the Bureau of Indian Affairs says you cannot use any of that evidence as evidence. And so they declined to re-extend federal recognition.